Hey everyone, I hope your 2024 is going well. I am excited to have Jane Cook with me today. She's a classical conversations mom, a presidential historian, and she's going to talk to us about going back to original source documents and some of the things that made our founding fathers so wonderful. So let's jump in.
Classical Conversation Studios presents Refining Rhetoric with CEO Robert Bortins, a podcast where faith, business, politics, and classical education meet. Join us as we use the classical tools of rhetoric to seek truth in every arena of life.
Hello and welcome back to another episode of Refining Rhetoric. Today my guest is Jane Hampton Cook. Jane is an award-winning author of 10 books, a national media commentator, a columnist, a former White House communications staffer, and a presidential historian. Her passion is to inspire patriotism through her writings, historical scholarship, and TV appearances. And her most recent book is War of Lies, When George Washington Was the Target and Propaganda Was the Crime. Jane, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
Now, you have studied a lot of the presidents and leaders throughout United States history. And what initially drew you to study these men and women?
Well, I was working in Texas, where I grew up, for then Governor George W. Bush, and he really liked history. He studied history in college, and I was the webmaster, the web gal, and I discovered that I could post stories about Texas history at the time on the governor's office website, and it was bipartisan. It could appeal to all sorts of people. And I knew that when I became a mom, I wanted to do some writing, and I wanted to write books. And so history just sort of was where I landed. And then in the White House, I discovered that the White House history section of the White House website was among the most popular sections. It kind of topped out, especially Abraham Lincoln's biography. And so that's what drew me in, is that I loved these stories and I wanted to keep learning more and discovering more.
Well, how did you get involved with politics to begin with? How did you get involved with doing webmastering with George W. as governor?
Well, my husband and I were in graduate school when the George H.W. Bush Presidential Library opened, and we were going to go work in higher education for the rest of our lives in the administrative realm. And then we just didn't feel like we were fitting in very well. I think some of the controversies you see right now on college campuses, we were starting to see that even, that far back. And so we just moved over to the political realm, and we had a friend who worked for Governor Bush, and he put in a good word. And back then websites were new, right? They were very basic. They were very easy to learn the technology. Now it's a little bit more complicated, but back then it was new, and they were new to politicians. They didn't exactly know what to do with them. And, can we post the governor's bio? Is that too much promoting on a government website? I mean, those were the kinds of questions we were asking. We weren't even talking about video at that point on a website. And so that's what drew us in. And I really wanted, it was an opportunity to, serve the people of Texas, and then, serve the United States of America, and, in this new technology. But deep down, I always just wanted to be a mom. And so I wanted to be a mom, and I wanted to write books and keep my head in kind of an intellectual space. And that was sort of my dream. And that's exactly, what I ended up doing, because I have 3 kids now. One of them's grown, and then the other one's in high school, and then the other one is in classical conversations. He's 10.
That's really sweet that you've chosen to homeschool and use classical conversations, especially someone who's just done so much research over leadership and what it means to be a good leader. And you've written these 10 books. So I was wondering if there was some themes that you have seen, especially, for us parents, as we think about raising our own children, are there qualities that you see in these leaders, or maybe there are things that you see in the bad leaders that we should be, just try to avoid?
Right. Well, there's a quote from John Adams that I think is really applicable. So he talked about how the preservation of liberty depended upon both the intellectual character and the moral character of the people. And so from his point of view, as long as knowledge and truth and virtue were diffused generally, broadly among the people, then it would be impossible for them to be enslaved. It would be impossible for them to not know reality and the truth. But that could only be brought to pass if you debased their understanding or you corrupted their hearts. So John Adams really valued truth and knowledge and moral virtue. And so I think we've seen sometimes in our society when there are narratives that don't turn out to be accurate in the end, or the story changes a lot. We've seen some narratives in our culture do that. And that's what you end up with are some people believe one thing, some people believe the opposite. And so what's reality? And I think that that's really what people are hungry for, is they want transparency. They want to know the truth. They want to understand reality, and they want that integrity to be in all of our institutions, whether it's our government agencies or higher education or our schools. If we're homeschooling, that concept of truth and virtue was really important to our founders, and that's what I think is something that people really long for today.
I 100% agree. And of course, we see this like polarization in our culture today. And one of the things that I've been thinking about, and maybe could get your take on it, is, it started, like you said before, why you kind of left academia, that this idea of your truth or my truth, that there's now not a universal truth that we can be united in and under. And even this idea of, you got your left and your right. But the general thought, maybe 20 or 30 years ago was they're pointing at the same direction, that they were both having the aim of creating a better society for the next generation. And now it seems like the left and the right aren't even pointing towards a similar goal, that we have, two different goals, two different views of history. So what do you see in our culture that has, would you agree with that statement, that we don't have a united idea of truth and that's kind of undermining us, or do you see something else going on?
No, I definitely see that divide that we have. I think you're right. 20, 30 years ago, we were pointing in the same general direction. We just had different ways of getting there. And now I think people don't know what direction they're headed, and you've got a really strong sense of polarization in our society. And, I think that and I don't want to jump ahead, but I think that the ideas of freedom of speech and freedom of thought and freedom to worship, and I think when all sides uphold those values and freedoms, then I think that helps all of society. Our founders, for example, they really, like this term diversity, I thought about, well, what did diversity mean to the founders? And for them, they were really divided over the issues of religion, because they looked at different religious denominations, Presbyterian versus the Church of England versus Baptist versus, they looked at all of that, and they were really divided. They're like, if I'm Presbyterian, I cannot hear a minister from the Church of England say a prayer. Like, I can't do that. That was how
Right.
divided they were. And John Adams talked about how that was their big hurdle. That it was like a variety of religions, like different countries, and that uniting them was really difficult. But the great thing about our country is that they believed in being free. And so they were confident enough in what they believed about God to let freedom of religion be free, that the government wasn't going to tell you what religion you had to be. And I think that application is sort of missing right now. We don't give that space and that opportunity to everyone in the way we, are trying to put everybody, certain ideas and ideology aren't allowed to be discussed in certain sectors. And so I think that's part of what our founders understood, is that you had to let some things be free, because they believed the truth would always rise to the surface. Certainly Ben Franklin set our standards for freedom of speech and freedom of the press, because he was a newspaper publisher. He was canceled in the colonial
Right.
era. And so, there were just those things, they worked out some of that, and now we're trying to rework it, I think.
Now, since you're a presidential historian and, you write these books and you've seen children growing up today, what is our young people's view of the presidency? Is it positive or negative? And do they have a constitutional view of it, or have they been shaped by other ideas?
Well, I think you're seeing the shaping of other ideas coming out of academia, in particular, university world. And so I think that I think it kind of goes back to that lack of trust, and this, when our institutions don't uphold truth and transparency, then that breaks down. And, I've seen young adults that I've, interacted with question, well, why do we need a constitution, or isn't that kind of outdated? I had a physical therapist talking about that, and he was a new American. He'd only been here a few years, but he was questioning whether we even needed a constitution. And so I think that there is a really strong divide and a lot of questioning that's going on. And so I think if there was more trust in those systems and in the way truth was communicated, I don't know there would be as much questioning and division.
We talked a little bit about some of these quotes from presidents. What made presidents that really stood up and inspired young people or inspired our country? Is there a theme in their lives that you've seen?
When I wrote a book, several years ago, it's a devotional book. It's called Stories of Faith and Courage from the Revolutionary War. And it's 365 devotional stories based on the writings of the founders, along with scripture and a prayer. And when I wrote that, when I started doing the research, I thought, maybe George Washington is overrated. Maybe, and I went into it with some skepticism. But that was really the first time in my life that I started reading the writings of people like George Washington. And the more I studied him, the more I realized, wow, what made him a great leader is that it was not all about him. Because there were men around him that were seeking glory on the battlefield. And that's not what he was looking for. He was looking to preserve his army. He was putting the needs of his army above his own at times. It was that servant leadership. Look, if I have to look bad because we need to retreat, I'll do it if it'll preserve my army and keep a remnant still fighting. And George Washington was very well mannered. He really prioritized being polite, and that really went a long way. That's one reason why people gravitated toward him, is that he was polite. Even if he was talking to one of those wayward generals, he by and large was really polite about it. And I think that really helped him. And so the people gravitated toward him because he was a man of integrity, and because he did put the needs of America and Americans above his own glory, his own, self-interest. And I think that's what really made him such a remarkable leader, is that ability to put others first.
Now, your latest book is A War of Lies, and talking about the propaganda that George Washington saw. Many of us are unaware what propaganda was going on then. Of course, we all know that he was our first president. But tell us a little bit about life back then and how they were able to attack him and why they attacked him.
Well, George Washington, as a young man during what historians call the French and Indian War, he became this media darling because he was going out to the west, the Ohio River Valley, and doing these missions and trips. But he got accused of being an assassin. And it was because the terms of capitulation with the French got all translated incorrectly, but he had to deal with fake news, is what we would use maybe to describe it today, in the newspaper about him. And you wouldn't think that would have been an issue, but back then the problem was communication. It just took too long to get one idea to the next place. And so that was part of what he was dealing with. But when he became the commanding general of the Continental Army in 1775, he ended up dealing with someone who counterfeited letters. They wrote letters in his name, in Washington's name, and they published them. And that's what the crux of my book is about, is who wrote those letters. And I identify 4 suspects, and George Washington did not know who was impersonating him. And I think I have figured it out. And some of it goes back to what I was just talking about, where people around him were really seeking glory, and there was jealousy of him. And that's what I think drove the person that I think wrote those letters. And And so again, it's about integrity. And seeing, and then also in this book, I do talk a lot about Ben Franklin, because Ben Franklin was writing newspaper articles about George Washington in the 1750s. And so the visual, if you're familiar with the snake graphic, the join or die graphic, that's something that Ben Franklin created. But the person that the news article was about, it was right next to that graphic in the newspaper, was all about George Washington. And so Ben Franklin really did play a really important role in developing the printing business in America. And people in Georgia learned about what was happening in Philadelphia because of Ben Franklin's newspaper and because of the guidelines he established for freedom of speech and freedom of the press. Franklin would tell his readers, look, my job is not to tell you the truth. My job is to present several points of view and allow you to figure out what the truth is. If I just published, what I wanted, then you would only know my opinion and not other people's opinions. And so those were the standards that he really, you could call him almost the father of freedom of speech and freedom of the press in America.
Thanks for practicing the 15 tools of learning with me on refining rhetoric. But if you want to dive even deeper, get practical advice on how to assess your students' learning more effectively, and get hands-on guidance, we have a service called the Classical Learning Cohort. A CC mom who just went through it named Bethany just said it helped her become a better communicator, listener, assessor, and teacher in her home with her girls. And by signing up for this cohort, the same thing can happen with you. It meets online 6 times per semester in a small group with like-minded parents and a leader that's going to help you understand the classical model and gain confidence as that lead learner in your homeschool and in your local classical conversations community. They are guided by veteran homeschool parents, and in that cohort, you will learn and practice new skills such as giving and receiving assessment. You'll learn how to draw your student out into each lesson by applying exordium and developing new tools for reviewing. And finally, you'll learn to mentor and be a mentor with other homeschoolers from around the world. So whether you're CC parent, director, tutor, or other CC leader, and you're looking to grow in your classical education journey, join us at classicalconversations.com/cohort. That's the Classical Learning Cohort. You can sign up today at classicalconversations.com/cohort, and you can see that link in the show notes below. Now let's jump back in. Now, freedom requires some responsibility and on your part. And it seems like over the last 8 years or so, the freedom of the press, while it's precious and much needed, that they have no longer taken that responsibility on. What did that look like back then? And what's the danger of the press abusing that freedom now?
Well, Ben Franklin talked about that without freedom of thought, there can be no such thing as wisdom, and there can be no such thing as public liberty without freedom of speech. And that you could, take away liberty if you started with suppressing freedom of speech. And he wrote those words when he was 16 years old. He was a young man when he wrote one of the most profound things he ever said. There is a lot of cancel culture suppression, especially through the social media world and the algorithms that, take down people's accounts if they say something that the AI doesn't like and that the programmers behind the AI don't like. So we are really in a dangerous time. You really do have to let freedom of thought flourish and to give people the freedom to be wrong and to make mistakes. And sometimes you have an opinion because you have only received certain information. But if you gain other types of information, your opinion might change. And that's what's I think happening right now, is that these big social media companies are trying to clamp down on speech using these algorithms. And the government is violating the First Amendment when they hire a third party to do that suppression. And so we are living in a really dangerous time because going back to that John Adams quote, knowledge needs to be diffused generally among the body of a nation. Otherwise, you debase people's understanding. And on something like COVID, something that's new, when it was new in 2020, I think the people would have been okay with this answer on a lot of things. I don't know, because at the beginning they didn't know, and it's better to say I don't know than to say something that you don't know is true. And that's part of, I think, what we're sort of living through right now is just this hunger. People now are hungry for truth and reality.
Yeah, I know. I think Ireland is working on passing a free speech ban where if you say something that the government doesn't approve of, you can be thrown in jail. I know the U.S. has a guy who put a meme up about Hillary Clinton voters voting the day after the election, got put in jail for, I think he's maybe out now, but they put him in jail for a couple months. Why the rise of this anti-free speech? And have we seen that in history, or have you seen that in your historical studies in the past?
Certainly you do see that when there's an authoritarian or totalitarian impulse coming from a government. I know that when some people were starting to be blacklisted a few years ago, and certain members of Congress were saying to companies, don't hire anyone in this category because we don't want them to be able to have jobs. I went and I looked at the history of blacklisting, and I discovered that, well, that's what Nazi Germany did in the very beginning. They started blacklisting business owners, and they were Jewish. And then they had a long list of people, and we don't want that in our society. And but that's what I think, that impulse is there right now among certain groups of people and in certain sectors. And so it's definitely something to be concerned. And I think doing shows like this and this podcast world really has opened up the ability for people to communicate in a way that's not controlled by anyone but the people thinking the thoughts. And so being able to have a place to podcast is really important. And that's why you've seen certain companies like Rumble pop up when YouTube started censoring different accounts. And I think we have to teach our children too about discernment, right? We can't listen to everything that we hear and just assume that it's true. We have to teach them to use those critical thinking skills. And that's one area where the classical model is so great, because especially when they get to be middle school and high school, and they learn the fallacies of logic and argumentation, and they learn, how to look for those holes in people's arguments about things in their rhetoric. That's really important. And one of the books that I recently wrote, called The Submarine and the Spies, is about, it starts off, it's a novel about the American Revolution, but then all the main characters were classically educated and rhetoric, and that was part of their education. This was at Yale College in the 1770s, and so they were really gifted at being able to debate each other. They debated the issue of slavery. They debated whether or not girls should receive the same education as boys. And our society needed people to be debating those issues. Otherwise, we wouldn't have solved those problems. And so we've got to have the freedom to think. And that's one really good thing about podcasting, is that we're able to get some of those ideas out there.
Yeah, I mean, even we've seen on our podcast sometimes, the episodes seem to be shadow banned or we're not getting out there. So even podcasting isn't 100% going to be able to get our word out. And we always need people sharing our episodes and figuring out ways around the algorithms, because they are trying to censor freedom of speech. They are trying to censor ideas that don't match the narrative. And, it's very, very scary. You mentioned, and probably people don't know this, but my wife is half Jewish, and her grandfather actually immigrated to the United States as a teenager from Germany, and his family was one of the ones that was blacklisted by the Germans, and they were basically, because they were a well-known and well-established business-owning family there, they were told, you got 2 weeks to leave, otherwise you're not going to be able to leave Germany. Her grandfather and that part of the family left. Some of their, family members decided to stay behind. He eventually enlisted in the U.S. Army after he turned 18 and got to go back to Germany and, was there when Hitler committed suicide. So it is a very scary, slippery slope, and it doesn't happen. It seems to happen gradually until it doesn't. And I think that's why it's so important to stand up now. I always say you can vote yourself into communism or socialism or fascism, whatever your favorite term is for these left-wing ideas, but you have to shoot your way out. So it's very important that we stand up before we have to start the alternative ideas.
Right. And, in late September, and in the month of September, I was I had come across a story about early Jewish immigrants to America. And the story just wouldn't leave me alone. So I wrote about it on my Substack, and it was a week before the attacks in Israel when I published it. And what happened was there were a Jewish family in Portugal in 1720. The government officials who were the members of the Inquisition came to take Moses. I'm sorry, not Moses, Abraham Sychus was his name. He hid in a laundry basket, and they got him out to England, and then he brought his family eventually to Newport, Rhode Island. And in America, they could build a synagogue, which they couldn't have a synagogue, in Portugal. And then his grandson, Moses, welcomed George Washington to that synagogue in 1790. And here he's welcoming a government official who's saying to him, "We want you to have freedom of religion." And that was the complete opposite of his grandfather's experience with the Inquisition. And so I think we don't always maybe appreciate that even that far back in our own history, people were fleeing oppression. And certainly that was the case in this particular family.
Now, I know they say history is written by the winners, and I know as a person who've written about newspaper articles about things going on that even I participated in, it's very difficult to always get in all the facts or all the relevant details with whatever your word count or time limitations are. So we have a lot of writers or at least students that listen to this podcast, or people who are teaching students how to write. Like, how do you look at history and making sure that you have the most accurate account possible, especially for people who might be writing history papers in a challenge program?
Well, I like to look first at what the person said about themselves. So if I'm writing about a historical person, I like to read their letters and diaries and anything that I can get my hands on, depending on the time frame that I'm looking at, because I want to know what they thought first. Then I will look at historical newspapers that were contemporary to that person at the time. And then if I still need to understand what was going on, I'll go look at an encyclopedia, or I'll look at what maybe a more modern historian wrote about them, because I think it's really important to get that person's point of view. And what happens sometimes is some people, like John Adams and Abigail Adams, and then John Quincy and Louisa Adams, they left a lot of letters and a lot of diary material. But someone like Martha Washington, there's not very many letters that survived. And so that's kind of where some of the, where it's tricky is, how do you get something accurate if you don't know that person's point of view? And that's where, you have to use your best judgment, and probably why we have a lot more books about the Adams family than we do about Martha Washington, for example. And so that, I will say, if you've got people that are, writing historical things, there's the National Archives has a website called founders.archives.gov. And you can search through the writings that are transcribed from their handwriting of George Washington, John Adams, like, anyone you can think of probably is in this list, of this database. So that's how you can find things. And so I had an editor tell me, you can't use the word cowboy to describe anything in the American Revolution. It didn't come about till later. So I was like, no, I think they call Connecticut refugees cowboys. So sure enough, there's a letter to George Washington with the word cowboy in it, talking about these refugees. And so little things like that we might not connect the word cowboy to the American Revolution yet. Yeah, it was there. And so that database is really good in allowing you to search and read and find out what people said. I looked for the word corruption to see how many times, George Washington used that word, or John Adams, and they used it a lot. They were concerned about corruption. They were trying to, in the Constitution, there are safeguards built into it to help protect the American people from corruption. It's not foolproof, but that's why we have checks and balances built into our system.
Now, we're excited in the United States because we're having a 250th anniversary celebration, our birthday celebration in 2026. Of course, we have an election before then and an election that year as well. But what would you hope the next president does? What would they accomplish in this time to really go back to that, I think, perspective of the founding fathers and freedom of speech? What are those things you would recommend to them?
Well, I think that you can't, the tricky thing with something like patriotism is you can't make someone love you, right? Like, we've seen a lot of movies on that. You can't do that very well. But I think by sharing the stories of our nation's founding, that's how we build understanding of where we have come from, both on the pitfalls and things we got wrong and the things that we got right along the way. And I really would like to see a president be able to unite the American people and to focus on what we have in common with each other. It seems like that would be really, that because there's so much controversy in our culture today, that seems like a very far off idea, but that's what I would like to see. And I'd like people to rediscover the stories of people like Peter Salem, who was a slave and he got his freedom in 1774, and he got a musket and he trained with the Minuteman, and he was part of the Battle of Concord in 1775, and then he served, I think, 6 years in the Continental Army. And those are the stories that I'd like us to rediscover, is just to know there were people who went before us, who fought hard for this liberty. And, even though it feels at times like it's slipping away from us, I think you're right. We've got to talk about it to help prevent us from not being able to talk about it. And so I think if a president could do that, that would be great. It's just hard with the way the media is right now. I think it's really tough on they play a really strong role in how things play out. But I think that's becoming more and more decentralized. I'm not sure people are buying it as much as they used to.
No, I don't think so. I mean, I know, like, if you're a Republican, people accuse you of watching Fox, but I can't barely stand it, except for when you're on as a guest or my mom, then it's worth tuning into. But and even like CNN or Disney, I mean, it sounds like, the stuff that people are just realizing it's garbage. It's not true. It's polarizing. It's not uplifting. And they're looking for alternative media, which is why, certain podcasters that have become famous and you never would have thought, peg those people to be the thought leaders that they are. So it's just been it's an interesting time, and I am optimistic about the future, but know that because we've violated the laws of nature and nature's God for so long, there's got to be consequences to those, and that's obviously a sad part of our history, or will be a sad part of our history. What are you working on now? You got any upcoming books that we should look forward to, or just any fun things you're going to release on your Substack?
So in January, I'm going to launch, I've just been working on it this week for Moms for America, but I've taken my novel, The Submarine and the Spies, and I've written like a whole study guide for it so that a homeschool parent could use it. They could use it to teach literature, the hero's journey. They could use it to teach history. And so what I have is a packet of lessons and quizzes and a test. And some sample lessons that would really be helpful to a parent, or a homeschool parent, or even in the classroom. And I'm going to start trying to get some of this into regular classrooms as well. And that's one thing I'm working on. And then in terms of creative writing, I've been working on a picture book, like a gift book called A Great and Grateful Nation, Our Miraculous Founding. And I'm using art and short essays to tell you the story of the revolution, so that if you don't want to sit and read a big, thick book, you can flip through And with a lot of pictures, a little bit amount of text, you can get the story of our miraculous founding. And then in 2025, there's a movie coming out called The American Miracle, and it's about the role of Providence in the founding of our nation. And I'm a cast member in that movie, and so it's coming out in 2025. And I think that will really help because people really respond well to films, and to see the sacrifices and to see that the Continental Army's movements were hidden by a big fog, and that's how they retreated. And there's no explanation for that other than the miraculous hand of God. And that's how they viewed it at the time. And so those are the kinds of stories that I hope get out through these different, opportunities.
Sounds wonderful. Well, Jane, how do we connect with you? Is there social media, or what's your Substack address, website? And because I know that our followers and listeners would love to hear more.
Sure. So I have my website is janecook.com, and then my Substack is janehamptoncook.substack.com. And I usually write an article about once a month for the Substack. I've got one coming up on December 16 about the Boston Tea Party, because it is the 250th anniversary this year of the Boston Tea Party, and so that's coming out in a few days. Mm-hmm. And but those are the two best ways to get me. I'm at Jane Hampton Cook on all the social media.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you for all that you do and to preserve our history. And I just loved how you go back to the original source documents, because that's something that we preach and teach here at Classical Conversations. And it's just good to see that being used in real life. It's not something that we just made up, but our best historians are using it.
Well, thank you. Yes, thank you very much.
I really enjoyed hearing how our founding fathers had a classical education, and it just reinforces that idea that we need a classical education for our students still today. I would encourage you to read Jane's books, and please share our podcast, give it a rating, share it with a friend, because we can't grow without you, and just everything that you do means so much to us. So be sure to share the Refining Rhetoric podcast today.
Thank you for listening to Refining Rhetoric with Robert Bortins. Want more? Make sure to subscribe so you won't miss an episode. You can also follow us on social media to continue the conversation, and visit classicalconversations.com/rhetoric to find out how you can join a local homeschool community.